January 17, 1945. Aachen, Germany. ****. The first American boots touched German soil not with thunder, but with silence. Snow fell in slow, deliberate flakes over the shattered cathedral spires of Aachen, the ancient city of Charlemagne now reduced to skeletal ruins. The air tasted of ash and cold stone. A young mother pressed herself against the cellar wall of what had once been a bakery, her 2 children, a boy of 7, a girl barely 5, clinging to her threadbare coat. Through the splintered boards above, she could hear them, the conquerors, speaking in that sharp foreign cadence she had been taught to fear. Their footsteps crunched through debris. She held her breath. She had heard the stories. Every woman in the Reich had heard the stories. Now the Americans were here, and there was nowhere left to run. But when the door finally opened, flooding the cellar with pale winter light, what stepped through was not the monster of Goebbels' imagination. It was a boy himself, perhaps 20 years old, his helmet too large for his head, his rifle lowered. He looked at the mother. He looked at the children. And then, slowly, he reached into his field jacket and pulled out a small brown rectangle wrapped in waxed paper. Chocolate. He held it toward the children, and in that gesture an entire ideology began to crumble. This is not a story of battles. This is a story of what came after, when the guns fell silent and the real war began. The war for the German soul. For 12 years, the children of the Third Reich had been fed a single narrative as relentlessly as they had been fed their rations of black bread and ersatz coffee. The enemy was coming. The enemy was subhuman. The enemy would destroy everything sacred, your home, your family, your fatherland. The propaganda machine of Joseph Goebbels had worked with surgical precision, carving fear and hatred into the collective consciousness of 80 million Germans. The Jew was vermin. The Slav was cattle. And the American? The American was a mongrel, a race-mixed, culturally bankrupt, jazz-corrupted degenerate whose only strength came from Jewish financiers and Negro soldiers. They would come, the propaganda promised, not as liberators but as locusts. They would rape. They would pillage. They would reduce Germany to ashes and salt the earth behind them. By 1945, as the Wehrmacht collapsed on both fronts, this narrative intensified to fever pitch. Radio broadcasts warned German civilians to flee westward ahead of the Soviet advance, but to resist the Americans with everything they had left. Die Werewolf resistance movement was organized. Children and old men given Panzerfausts and told to fight to the last breath. Hitler, in his final radio address, promised that history would remember German resistance, that their suffering would birth a new Reich from the ruins. Surrender was treason. Cooperation was death. And so, when the Americans crossed the Rhine in March of 1945, they expected to face not just soldiers, but an entire population turned fanatic. They expected Stalingrad in every town, a knife in every shadow. What they found instead was something far more dangerous to the Nazi myth, a population exhausted, starving, and desperate, not for victory, but for survival. The German civilians who huddled in their cellars that winter had not eaten properly in months. The ration system that had sustained the home front through 5 years of war had finally collapsed. By early 1945, the official daily ration in urban areas had fallen to 1,200 calories, half of what a human body needs to function. But even that was theoretical. The trains no longer ran. The warehouses were empty. The bread was sawdust. The milk was powder and water. Mothers watered down soup until it was little more than warm dishwater with floating potato peels. Children cried themselves to sleep with hunger cramps. The elderly simply stopped waking up. In the countryside, farmers hoarded what little they had, knowing the cities could offer nothing in return. The Reichsmark was worthless. The barter economy had returned, medieval and desperate. a family heirloom for a dozen eggs, a wedding ring for a sack of potatoes, sex for butter. The social fabric, held together by Nazi discipline for over a decade, was unraveling thread by thread. And then the Americans arrived, and they brought with them something the German people had forgotten existed: abundance. The American soldiers who swept across Western Germany in the spring of 1945 were the best-fed, best-equipped military force in human history. Each soldier received roughly 4,000 calories per day, more than twice what German civilians were allocated. Their rations included not just bread and meat, but luxuries that had vanished from German tables years ago: canned fruit, condensed milk, real coffee, sugar, butter, and chocolate. Mountains of chocolate. The Hershey's ration had been designed as an emergency field ration, a 4-ounce bar of chocolate so deliberately unpalatable, mixed with oat flour to prevent soldiers from eating it casually, that it was nicknamed Hitler's secret weapon by the GIs themselves. But to German children who had not tasted real chocolate since 1942, it was manna from heaven. The GIs also carried their own personal stashes: Hershey's tropical bars, sent from home in care packages, purchased at the PX, hoarded and traded. Chocolate had become, in the American military economy, a form of currency. A bribe for information. A gift for a French girl. A trade for a bottle of cognac. But in Germany, chocolate became something else entirely. It became a weapon, not of destruction, but of disarmament. It became the thing that made the propaganda impossible to believe. The first encounters were tentative, suspicious. American soldiers entering towns that had surrendered without a fight would find the streets empty, the windows shuttered, the silence absolute. Orders were clear: no fraternization with the enemy. Do not trust them. Do not help them. These people cheered while their army burned Europe. They are complicit. They are guilty. But the soldiers were young, most of them barely out of their teens, farm boys from Iowa and shop clerks from Brooklyn, and when they saw the children, stick-thin, hollow-eyed, dressed in rags, the orders felt impossible to follow. A child is a child. Hunger has no nationality. And the chocolate in their pockets was just chocolate. Private James McManus from Philadelphia would later write in a letter home, "We came into this town, I don't remember the name, somewhere near Cologne. The place was flattened. We'd been told not to give them anything, that they'd have to learn what they did to everyone else. But then I saw this little girl, couldn't have been more than 6, and she looked just like my niece back home. She wasn't asking for anything. She was just standing there, staring. And I thought, what the hell did she do? She didn't invade Poland. So I gave her my chocolate bar. And she cried. Not happy crying, like she didn't know what it was. Like she'd forgotten. Multiply that scene by thousands. In every town, every village, every shattered city from Aachen to Munich, the same quiet transaction repeated itself. A soldier reaching into his pocket. A child's tentative hand. A mother's tears. And with each exchange, the narrative constructed so carefully by Goebbels collapsed a little further. Because the chocolate was not just food. It was evidence. Evidence that the Americans were not monsters. Evidence that the propaganda had been lies. Evidence that the world beyond the Reich was not the barbaric wasteland they had been promised, but something else entirely. Something prosperous, generous, incomprehensibly wealthy. How could a nation be so rich that its soldiers gave away chocolate to the children of their enemies? What kind of empire was this? The Soviet soldiers arriving from the East brought terror, justified, perhaps, by what the Wehrmacht had done in Russia, but terror nonetheless. The stories of mass rape, of looting, of villages emptied and populations deported were not propaganda. They were real. German civilians fled westward in vast columns, preferring uncertain mercy from the Americans to certain vengeance from the Soviets. And when they arrived in American-occupied zones and were given food instead of bullets, the contrast was impossible to ignore. An elderly schoolteacher named Margarethe Bauer, interviewed decades later, remembered, "We had been told the Americans would be worse than the Russians. That they would torture us, enslave us, erase Germany from the map. When they arrived in our town, we hid in the church. They found us anyway. We thought it was the end." But the officer, he was a tall man, very serious. He spoke to us in broken German. He said they were there to restore order, not to punish civilians. He said the war was over and we needed to think about rebuilding. Then his men handed out rations. Real coffee, canned meat, chocolate for the children. My grandson took the chocolate and looked at me, and I realized he didn't remember what it tasted like. He was 9 years old, and he had never known anything but war. And this American, this enemy, had just given him a taste of peace. The symbolism of chocolate was not accidental. It was not lost on the soldiers, and it was certainly not lost on the civilians. Chocolate, in the European imagination, had always been a luxury, a food of celebration, of Christmas, of birthdays, of better times. The Nazis had rationed it out of existence early in the war, diverting cocoa imports to the military, to party officials, to the black market. By 1943, chocolate had vanished entirely from German stores. It became a memory, a ghost, something grandparents told stories about. And then the Americans brought it back. Not as a ration, not as something earned or deserved, but as a gift, freely given, inexplicable. This generosity was strategic, whether the individual soldiers realized it or not. The Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force had learned from the disaster of World War I, when the Treaty of Versailles and the subsequent economic starvation of Germany had bred the very resentment that birthed Nazism. This time, the plan was different. This time, the Americans would feed the enemy. They would rebuild the enemy. They would, in time, transform the enemy into an ally. The Marshall Plan, announced in 1947, would pour billions of dollars into European reconstruction, including West Germany. But that grand strategy began here, in these small moments, in cellars and street corners, with chocolate bars and canned milk and sea rations shared with starving children. The message was clear: we are not here to destroy you. We are here to save you from yourselves. But the German civilians did not understand this immediately. For many, the first reaction was not gratitude but confusion, even suspicion. Why would the enemy help them? Was it a trick? A psychological tactic to lower their guard before the real punishment began? The 12 years of Nazi indoctrination did not evaporate overnight. For some, it never did. There were Germans who refused American aid on principle, who clung to the delusion that the Führer would return, that the Wunderwaffen, the miracle weapons, would still turn the tide, that Germany would rise from the ashes and reclaim its destiny. These were the bitter enders, the true believers, and they were fewer than the Nazis had hoped but more than the Allies had expected. They spat at collaborators. They sabotaged relief efforts. They poisoned wells and hid weapons for a resistance that never truly materialized. But they were a minority. For most Germans, survival required a rapid and pragmatic recalibration of reality. The Americans had food. The Americans had medicine. The Americans had the power to decide who lived and who starved. And so, slowly, reluctantly, the German people began to accept the gifts. They began to queue at the aid stations. They began to register with the military government. They began to speak, hesitantly, of rebuilding. And the children, who had no ideology to shed, who knew only hunger and cold and fear, reached for the chocolate without hesitation. By the summer of 1945, The immediate crisis of starvation had been averted in the American and British zones. The military government established rationing systems, commandeered supplies, requisitioned food from the countryside, and supplemented it with imports from the United States. The official ration rose to 1,500 calories, still insufficient, but enough to prevent mass death. Soup kitchens were established. Orphanages were staffed. Schools were reopened. But the psychological damage was deeper and would take far longer to heal. An entire generation of German children had been raised in a totalitarian state, taught to worship the Führer, to despise the weak, to glorify war and sacrifice. Denazification programs attempted to undo this conditioning through re-education. Mandatory screenings of concentration camp footage, revised textbooks, trials, and tribunals. But the real transformation happened not in classrooms or courtrooms, but in the small, unscripted moments of human contact. A soldier playing catch with a German boy using a baseball, teaching him the rules of a game the child had never heard of. A medic treating an old woman's infected wound without asking whether she had been a party member. A chaplain holding a service in a bombed-out church, attended by both Americans and Germans, praying in different languages for the same peace. These interactions, repeated thousands of times across the occupied zones, began to construct a new narrative. The Americans were not supermen, but they were not monsters either. They were ordinary people, with families and farms and lives they wanted to return to, who happened to come from a place where chocolate was common and freedom was assumed. And maybe, just maybe, that place was worth emulating rather than destroying. The chocolate became a symbol of this shift. Years later, German memoirs of the occupation period would return again and again to that first taste of American chocolate. It appears in novels, in oral histories, in interviews with survivors. It is remembered not just as food, but as the moment when the future became imaginable again. One woman, interviewed in the 1980s, recalled, "When the American soldier gave my daughter chocolate, she didn't know whether to eat it or hide it. We had been hiding for so long, hiding food, hiding valuables, hiding ourselves. But the soldier just smiled and nodded, encouraging her to eat it right there. And when she did, and her face lit up, I broke down. Because I realized she was going to survive. Not just physically, but as a person. She was going to have a childhood after all. Not the childhood I had planned, not the Reich we were promised, but something. And that was enough." This transformation was not universal, and it was not immediate. The wounds of war, physical, psychological, moral, would take decades to heal. Germany was divided, occupied, reshaped by powers beyond its control. The Nuremberg trials forced a reckoning with crimes many Germans preferred to forget. The Berlin blockade and the subsequent Cold War turned Germany into a battleground of ideologies once more. East and West, communist and capitalist, Soviet and American, the Iron Curtain split the nation in two. But in the Western zones, something remarkable happened. The Germans who had tasted American chocolate, who had been fed by their former enemies, who had seen the Marshall Plan rebuild their factories and their cities, made a choice. They chose democracy. They chose capitalism. They chose the West. Not because they were coerced, though the presence of American troops certainly influenced the decision, but because they had seen the alternative, and it worked. West Germany became, within a generation, one of the most prosperous nations in Europe. The economic miracle of the 1950s and 60s transformed a landscape of rubble into a modern industrial powerhouse. The generation that had grown up eating American chocolate became the generation that built Mercedes and BMW, that established the European Union, that swore never again, and meant it. But the question lingers, whispered in historical footnotes and late-night debates. Would it have happened without the chocolate? Without those small, human gestures of mercy in the immediate aftermath of total war? If the Americans had arrived as conquerors rather than liberators, as avengers rather than benefactors, would the story have been different? The answer, perhaps, lies in the contrast. In the Soviet zones, where occupation was punitive, where factories were dismantled and shipped east as reparations, where the ideology imposed was rigid and unforgiving, the population remained restless, resentful, watched. The Berlin Wall was not built to keep the West out, but to keep the East in. East Germans fled by the thousands, risking death for a chance to live in the other Germany, the Germany that had been rebuilt with American aid, the Germany where chocolate was plentiful and freedom was possible. The Marshall Plan provided the resources, but resources alone do not change hearts. The chocolate was not a bribe. It was a promise. A promise that the world did not have to be a zero-sum game of conquerors and conquered. That abundance was possible. That generosity was strength, not weakness. That the future could be built on something other than revenge. By the time the last American occupation forces withdrew from West Germany in the 1990s, after reunification, the memory of that first chocolate bar had become mythic. It was the story grandparents told their grandchildren, how the Americans came, not with chains, but with candy, how the conquerors became friends, how the enemy became an ally. But the myth is dangerous if it erases the complexity. The Americans did not come to Germany purely out of altruism. They came because they had won a war and needed to secure the peace. They fed the Germans because starving populations breed extremism, and the Soviet Union was already looming as the next threat. The chocolate was strategy. The kindness was policy. The Marshall Plan was not charity. It was investment. And yet, the soldiers who handed out the chocolate were not thinking about geopolitics. They were thinking about the child in front of them, who looked hungry and scared and human. They were thinking about their own children back home, or the children they hoped to have one day, and how they would want someone to treat them if the war had gone differently. They were, in that moment, acting not as instruments of state policy, but as individuals capable of empathy. That, perhaps, is the real lesson. That empathy, even when backed by overwhelming power, even when mixed with strategic interest, has the power to transform enemies into neighbors. That the choice to be kind, when one could easily be cruel, is the choice that defines not just individuals but nations. The winter of 1945 was the coldest in decades. Snow buried the rubble of German cities under a blank white shroud, hiding the devastation, softening the jagged edges of broken buildings. In the cellars and attics where families huddled for warmth, the cold was relentless. Coal was scarce. Wood was scavenged. The elderly and the very young did not always survive until spring. But in those dark months, in the occupied zones where American soldiers stood guard, there were moments of warmth that had nothing to do with fire. A child biting into chocolate, the sweetness flooding a mouth that had known only bitterness. A mother weeping not from despair, but from the shock of unexpected mercy. A soldier, barely more than a boy himself, learning that the enemy was not the monster he had been trained to kill, but a person, complicated, flawed, suffering, human. These moments did not erase the war. They did not absolve the guilt of those who had committed atrocities or supported a genocidal regime. They did not bring back the 6 million Jews murdered in the Holocaust, or the millions of soldiers and civilians dead on all sides. The chocolate could not undo the past. But it could, perhaps, build a different future. There is a photograph, taken in the spring of 1945, somewhere in the Rhineland. It is grainy, black and white, slightly out of focus, the work of an amateur with a box camera. It shows an American soldier, his helmet pushed back on his head, crouching in the street. In front of him is a small German girl, perhaps 4 years old, her dress patched and too large, her feet wrapped in rags. She is holding something in both hands, staring at it with an expression of wonder. Chocolate. Behind her, half hidden in a doorway, is her mother. Her face is turned toward the soldier, and even in the poor quality of the photograph, the emotion is clear. She is crying. Not the violent, wrenching sobs of grief, but the quiet, exhausted tears of someone who has carried too much for too long and has finally been given permission to set the burden down, if only for a moment. The soldier is smiling. It is not a triumphant smile, not the grin of a conqueror. It is gentle, almost shy, the smile of someone who has just realized he has the power to do a small kindness in a world that has seen too much cruelty. The photograph was never published, never used for propaganda, never seen by more than a handful of people. It ended up in a shoebox in an attic in Pennsylvania, where it was discovered decades later by the soldier's granddaughter, who donated it to a historical archive. It is one of thousands like it, small, unremarkable, forgotten. But it is also everything. Because the transformation of post-war Germany was not the work of presidents or generals or diplomats alone. It was the work of millions of small choices, made by ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. The choice to share instead of hoard, to forgive instead of avenge, to see the humanity in the enemy even when everything in your training and your experience tells you to look away. The chocolate was a symbol, yes, but symbols have power. They shape how we understand ourselves and our place in the world. For the Germans who received it, the chocolate represented the failure of the Nazi narrative. They had been promised that the Americans would destroy them, and instead the Americans fed them. That cognitive dissonance forced a reckoning that no amount of re-education programs or war crimes trials could have achieved alone. For the Americans who gave it, the chocolate represented something equally important: the recognition that victory is not an ending, but a beginning. That the true test of a nation's character comes not in how it treats its allies, but in how it treats its defeated enemies. That the choice to rebuild rather than destroy, to integrate rather than exclude, is the choice that determines whether peace will last a year or a generation. 75 years later, Germany is a democracy. It is America's ally, its trading partner, its friend. German soldiers serve alongside American soldiers in NATO operations around the world. The children who once reached for chocolate bars from the hands of occupiers are now grandparents, telling their own grandchildren stories about the war, about the hunger, about the strange foreign soldiers who spoke a harsh language but carried sweetness in their pockets. The scars remain. The memory remains. The responsibility remains. But so does the chocolate. Not the literal bars, long since eaten or discarded or rotted away, but the idea of it. The promise that even in the darkest moments, generosity is possible. That even between enemies, common ground can be found. That the future does not have to replicate the past. This is the legacy of the chocolate given by American soldiers to German children in the winter of 1945. Not that it solved every problem or healed every wound, but that it proved, in the simplest and most undeniable way, that the world the Nazis had constructed was a lie. That the enemy was not subhuman. That defeat was not annihilation. That from the ruins of total war, something new and better could be built. It was a small thing, a chocolate bar. But sometimes small things carry the weight of history. Sometimes a gesture of kindness, repeated thousands of times in thousands of places, becomes the foundation on which nations are rebuilt and futures are made. Sometimes the most powerful weapon is not a bomb or a bullet, but a gift freely given, asking nothing in return. And sometimes, in the cold and the hunger and the fear, the thing that saves us is not ideology or strategy or power, but the simple human impulse to feed a hungry child, regardless of what flag they were born under. That is the story the chocolate tells. That is the truth it holds. And that is why, 75 years later, the memory endures, not as propaganda, not as myth, but as a reminder of what we are capable of, in our best moments, when we choose mercy over vengeance and hope over despair. The snow has melted. The rubble has been cleared. The cities have been rebuilt. But the taste of that chocolate, sweet and unexpected and impossibly generous, lingers still.